So just to get started, a reminder of at the HC, when we use the term trauma, the definition of trauma is about an experience, not about necessarily an event. Can it be an event? Of course. All the big things that we see on TV and on the news are fucking trauma left and right. And it also doesn't mean that things that our brain might minimize or excuse isn't trauma. We're a culture that, well, I had food in my fridge growing up, so I didn't have anything to complain about. We're really good at comparison, and comparison is trauma. So I like to bring that definition to the forefront about once a month or once every 6 weeks, because it's not the definition that we were raised with, and to partner that with what our definition of recovery is, would be working towards my truest and highest self while accepting the shadow behaviors along the way that kept me alive. Those shadow behaviors are usually what pull us into therapy. They hold a lot of shame, they hold a lot of guilt, humiliation, embarrassment. And so a lot of that is what we talk about. And when it comes to terms like stress, terms like trauma triggers, terms like how do I keep my stuff in my hula hoop, per se, so that everybody around me isn't affected? Well, to be able to talk about that, we need to know what we're working towards, our recovery, and we also need to know what trauma is. I want to also remind the working clinical definition of trauma means that it causes biological changes in the body. I won't go into all of those tonight, but those biological changes in the body and where trauma is stored is why we have something called a trauma trigger today. It is, hey, sorry, my little old lady saw a shadow, even though she's blind. So when we're in present day, and maybe we know what the trauma is or the trigger, or maybe we don't, and our body just starts reacting. Something's happened that we know something's wrong. If we're unfamiliar with trauma, or if we're unfamiliar or maybe just starting our recovery program in therapy, sometimes that will be diagnosed as panic attack disorder, anxiety disorder, GAD. And it's not because that is wrong. It's just a diagnosis of symptoms. It's not the diagnosis of the core or the root. So when we talk about stressors, sometimes the stressors on the body are related to our, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not stamina, but our ability to cope definitely has to do with where I am in my recovery and how much capacity I have. It doesn't mean I'm weak. It has nothing to do with that. And it doesn't mean that something's wrong with me. It does mean that if I live or have lived in a state of survival, and another way of talking about that is dumping chemicals in my body all the time, adrenaline, cortisol. If I live in a state of survival, my capacity is going to be low. There's a really strong relationship between those two things. And when my capacity is low, what that means is I'm triggered a lot. One of our topics that we talked about, I think this was last week, forgive me if I'm wrong. Sometimes the meetings run together, but we talked about complex PTSD and how that gets triggered in the body. And so if we're easily triggered by any of our five senses, that doesn't mean we're weak. That doesn't mean something's wrong with us. That usually means my capacity is really short or really small because I'm living in a survival state. And the point or the intention behind a survival state is just that. It's preparing me for danger, and whatever is coming at me, I'm ready to go. So I might jump to loud sounds, or I might jump to someone walking in the room that I didn't see, those type of things. So when you say stressors, that could be a lot of things, but being able to stay focused when I'm stressed, if I've lived in a survival state, is a little bit unrealistic. One thing I mentioned last time as one of the tools is I really like to teach realistic expectations. I'm also a recovering perfectionist. And so when I think recovery and when I think solutions, well, in Amber's brain, that means all's good. I'm not anxious anymore. This coping skill is going to work and I'm going to feel better as soon as it's over. Boom. Man, that is so not true. What coping skills do is they help to increase that capacity. The more I use it, think of it as a savings account, not a checking account. The more I deposit, the more I use it, as in deposit something into it using a coping skill, the more capacity I build. If I'm only trying to use it in the moment when I'm stressed, I'm not going to notice a lot of effectiveness because I'm not building capacity. I'm still surviving the moment. So when you think of staying focused in a stressor, think of a realistic expectation of what that might look like. If you're someone like me and is a survivor of complex PTSD, survivor no longer suffering, what that means to my body is I need to come back down to baseline. I have to do things to release. Emotion is energy in motion. So if I'm anxious, if I'm fearful, if I'm angry, that has to be released. For some of us, that's tears. For some of us, that's kickboxing. For some of us, that's running or sitting down with my cat or my dog. But there has to be a release, something, there has to be movement with the body, because otherwise that trauma that's being stored in the body gets all shaken up and then it goes right back to that joint where it lives. And what we want to do with that trauma that we are breaking up and we are acknowledging it and telling its story is we want to break that energy up and get it moving into our energetic system or chakra system, because that's where it's metabolized. So to stay focused during a stressor would mean knowing my body and knowing what I need. When I have multiple trauma triggers happening at once, the very first thing that comes up for me, because it is my own personal tool, is I have to remove myself from the stimuli and I have to use a tool that turns my prefrontal cortex back on. This is a whole nother CFR. And if I remember, I'll do it next week, but 2 parts of our brain. One right here behind the forehead is called prefrontal cortex. It's in charge of logic, decision-making, analyzing. I'm missing one. Stop. And then amygdala is fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It's the one that keeps me alive. Don't worry, there's no quiz. Only thing I want you to know is when prefrontal cortex is on, amygdala is off. I have a need to be in fight, flight, freeze, fawn. But when amygdala comes on, prefrontal cortex goes off. This is also the part of the brain that is affected by numbing and medicating, what our culture calls addiction. Prefrontal cortex, logic, decision-making, and analyzing. Makes sense, right? When I'm numbing and medicating, when I'm in an addictive state or a relapse, I do shit I would never normally do. Well, that's because my prefrontal cortex isn't even on. Big problem. So when we're in that trauma trigger, the first thing I need to do in my body is remove myself from the stimuli. That means go outside. That means go upstairs, whatever the stimuli is, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And then I need a coping skill that turns this back on. Any breathing mechanism that you use, box breathing is what I use, it's going to turn that prefrontal cortex back on. Why? Because it's giving me oxygen. It's also a tool that requires me to think and count while I breathe. So if I fall into the lion's den or the lion's cage at the zoo, amygdala comes on. I can't count to 4 and inhale, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and hold for 4. My body, that is not what my body is doing in that moment, nor will it. I probably can't even count to 4 in that moment because all my body and my brain is supposed to do when that happens is keep me alive. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So to turn my prefrontal cortex back on, I use breathing tools, but sometimes what I'll also use is some yoga techniques, which are just stretching. Think about that for a second. If I'm in the middle of a trauma trigger, I'm not going to be able to use some amazing, beautiful meditation. Definitely don't recommend that. And what I can do, depending on fight, flight, freeze, fawn, if I know that about myself, if I know that about my story, mine happens to be freeze, survivor no longer suffering. And what that means for my body is if I go in to a stretch, am I going to be stretching when I fall into the lion's den? Nope. So what am I telling my body? It's okay, we're safe. If I'm causing my body to take up space instead of running, fighting, trying to please, or freezing, polyvagal, pretending like I'm dead. If I start stretching or go into a Wonder Woman pose, my body's going to say, wait a minute, this must not be dangerous. It sounds really simple because it is. It has to be. If I'm coming out of a trauma trigger and trying to get in the present moment, I don't need to be fucking thinking about, wait, what did she tell me to do? It needs to be as instinctual as fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So that's why I say use a coping skill that you like, that is your go-to. But it's also why I say practice it and put it in the savings account. Do box breathing when you're sitting at a stoplight and see how many rounds you can get in. When you're tired in front of your computer or at work, stand up and see how much space you can take up. Reach as far as your edges will go and notice what happens to your body. It is simple because it has to be simple. So the other thing that comes up for me is because I know many people with complex PTSD have been diagnosed with panic disorder, GAD, anxiety disorders, depression disorders. A common symptom that happens for my clients and clients that find us is rumination. That is worst case scenario. That is my mind won't stop. I can't go to sleep. That is rewind, play, like same shit over and over again. Food noise, like it doesn't have to be big and scary. It can just be repetitive. And that's called rumination. When you're in rumination, start humming. It stops immediately because we can't do both at the same time. If you have little ones, it's my 8-year-old's favorite one to do. If we're laying down and he's trying to go to sleep and he says, Mommy, she won't stop running. He says that about his brain. I just can't stop thinking about tomorrow. We'll start humming the song that I hummed him. I don't know if that's right grammar. That I sang to both of my boys when they were little. They're still little to me, so I still sing it. But the other thing that happens is I hum it to my little girl, my inner child. If I have a night terror, which sometimes I still do, if I'm super anxious because of a conflict that I'm having, or I get a text message from my mom that's one of those, Amber, I need you to call me. My whole body just, boom, there's the adrenaline. And 9 times out of 10, I'm 43 years old, by the way. 9 times out of 10, it's how are the boys doing at school? But it's the message that comes with it. So for me, that used to be a huge trauma trigger. Now it's dulled and it's just kind of more like an annoyance. But I want you to think about those coping mechanisms that you use. Last week, one of our fellow travelers mentioned that he sits on the bed and he rocks. That's self-soothing. Humming is self-soothing. What do we do when babies start crying? We start bumping them and rocking them, right? We start humming. Anything that you would do for a baby, do for your body. Frequently, I'll have sweatshirts on when it's 97 degrees outside because I like to keep my house cold. My body doesn't regulate temperature well, but I also like to be covered up. My body feels safe when I'm covered up. Even if like I'm okay. I'm not in a trauma trigger. I just notice that I like to be covered. I like to feel clothes on my skin. So when you think of these things and you're doing them proactively, you're building that capacity. So the things that we notice with that complex PTSD that we talked about last week, God, I hope it was last week. The more capacity we build, the lower the frequency of being triggered and the shorter the duration of the triggering. That's what recovery, that's a realistic expectation of complex PTSD recovery. It's not going to go away. And I don't say that to be the Debbie Downer. I say that because I need to know what a realistic expectation is, because otherwise I judge it as that doesn't work, which isn't true. If I know what it's supposed to do, the more I do it, the more it actually does work. It's like a muscle. A reminder that is incredibly supportive for me at times is to remember the intention of recovery. Remember when I said, when I hear a coping tool or a skill, I have real concrete black and white, oh, it's going to make it all better. And that's not a realistic expectation because that's not how our bodies work. But, and another really important definition for me is the intention of recovery. When we suffer trauma, the reason that we numb and medicate is because after that trauma, there was no repair. Repair meaning mom, dad, authoritative figure, loving person, recreating safety and giving me back my power. Trauma happens to individuals who are powerless. Trauma happens when we are powerless. That's why it's not always what's happening to me, but sometimes it's what's not happening to me, right? Abuse, neglect. So when we think of the intention of recovery, and I'm gonna be real honest, my inner teen comes out and she's sassy as hell. And she's like, fuck. Because what I know about recovery is it gives me the gift of awareness. The intention of recovery is to feel the things that I've been numbing for decades. Why am I numbing them? Because they fucking hurt. Because I don't know what to do with it, because it took my power away and it makes me feel powerless and afraid that it might happen again, whatever it is. And it gets louder. My body gets louder. Why? Because I'm numbing it and not listening to it. So today in a trauma trigger, when my body's screaming at me, guess what? It doesn't trust me yet. Remember when I said the frequency of triggers would decrease and the duration of the trigger would decrease? It's because trust is earned, not given. My body says, I'm going to protect you no matter what, even if I got to scream at you. I'm going to keep getting louder until you listen to me. Marlene's poor body for 2.5 days. The body doesn't give up on us. My team tells me their favorite amberism, which it is an amberism, but I'm quoting somebody else. I didn't make this up. Mind, thoughts, almost always wrong. I can make myself believe the sky is purple if I wanted to. Body can never be wrong. The intention of recovery is to feel. So if I'm in all the feels, the tool that I want to offer you, which again, my inner teen is like, fuck you. But it's gratitude. It's thanking my body for sending me the messages. She is my best friend. She wants nothing but to keep me safe. And sometimes I forget that that's her job. My body is my North Star. It is my compass. So when I shut her down, I numb her and I medicate her, she's got no choice but to get louder. So what happens when she starts talking to me? What happens when I start listening? She starts saying, oh boy, she's listening now. We better get it all out. Right? She's listening. We're connected. She's here. She's not numbing and she's not medicating. Remember, the body doesn't know the difference between emotional pain and physical pain. It's all the fucking same thing to the body. But when I recognize what I had to do to survive, whether that's ADSing, that is an amberism, always doing shit, fawning, people pleasing, cleaning, organizing. I'm good at that. I can find a closet to clean anytime I'm in an argument with my husband. Boy, are my closets like it. When I listen to my body, it builds the muscle of trust. And I don't have to do all those numbing behaviors that for years as a kid, I learned how to do to survive because my environment was unpredictable. It wasn't Jerry Springer worthy. We were never on TV. Cops were never called. But there was a lot of things that didn't happen. And there was a lot of things that did happen that my body perceived as trauma. And it's stored in joints, muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Makes a lot of sense why when I carry my trauma for 3 or 4 decades, I end up with an autoimmune disorder, right? I end up with chronic pain. Makes a lot of sense. So I want to offer, the first thing is gratitude for the body for the messages, but it's also the reframe of, wait a minute, my body is only doing what I'm asking it to do in recovery, which is feel to heal. If I can't feel, I don't know that something's wrong. I don't know that if I'm at North Myrtle Beach and my body's screaming, it's because at one point this wasn't a safe place. But you know what? I'm adult Amber now. I'm 43 years old and I can kick some ass. Like I'm pretty good at keeping me safe now. I do feel powerlessness and I also know what to do to take care of my body. And so she trusts me a lot more. But that was earned. So when we're talking about trauma triggers and we're talking about stressors, it is about walking out that muscle so it gets stronger and stronger, but it is caring for her or him in a way that I would care for my babies because those are the things that settle my body. HALT is known in the 12-step community, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. When I'm in one of those, I got no fucking capacity. It doesn't matter how many years of recovery I got. And you know what? Neither does my 6-year-old. Isn't that interesting? So when I support him in one of those, he regulates. I wonder what happens if I support me in one of those. I regulate. I have more capacity. I'm not saying this sarcastically and it's going to sound that way, but it's like fucking magic. Our body can only do so many things at once. And when we don't listen to it, it has to get louder. One last offering, especially if you have a relationship with anxiety that goes way back. If you notice anxiety in your body, whether you call it anxiety, whether you call it worry, um, it's when my tummy feels yucky, my GI system is messed up, my thoughts and ruminations won't stop, I have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, all those somatic responses that my body's trying to keep me alert just to make sure I'm safe. Thank you. And we're safe. The most powerful voice I hear is my own, because whose voice is in my head beating me up? And this is an I statement because this is my story. I can be brutal. And my loving parent, which is also me, can be very kind and can be grateful for the messages. When we are in those trauma triggers and we've pulled all the tools out, all of our favorite ones, all the ones that were like, shit, that usually works. Ice water on the face, like whatever. You've done all the tools, right? Try to remember a realistic expectation for a coping skill or for something that grows my capacity is to surf the wave, not stop the wave. Anxiety will never completely go away because my relationship with her goes back to in utero. She's never leaving me. And her purpose is to keep me safe, not hurt me. So when I recognize that as high tide and I'm anxious and I'm just on edge today, I don't always have to know why. Sometimes those are just typical normal emotions. Sometimes it's hormones. Sometimes it is a trauma trigger. Sometimes I might be on a safari ride and there's lions walking by. I mean, the body's doing what it's supposed to do. But what we can do is recognize it's not going to go away. We don't want it to go away because the intention of recovery is to feel. Something should happen when I see a lion walk by on the other side of the Jeep. Or maybe I am able to hold my pee 10 hours that day. Makes sense. There's a lot of capacity when I need it. So being able to remember that if I'm part of the reason that trust in self was damaged, it's also my responsibility to earn that back. So when she's talking to me, when she's sending me messages, when she's tired, when she's hungry, when she's lonely, or when she's angry, she's only telling me what she needs. And that usually is a core wound that wasn't met. So now I get the opportunity to meet it. That's reparenting.